After my husband died, I didn't enter his garage for 3 years. But one day I got a text from his number. "I'm alive, check the safe in the garage." When I went there in the morning and opened that safe, my life changed forever. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say that grief fades with time. They mean well when they say it. They press your hands at the funeral, bring you casseroles wrapped in foil, and whisper those words as if they were a prescription. It fades. 3 years later, standing in my kitchen in Portland, Oregon, with a mug of cold coffee in my hand and rain tapping against the window like a patient stranger, I could tell you with absolute certainty, they are wrong. Grief doesn't fade. It just learns to be quieter. Daniel Cole and I met at a friend's barbecue in the summer of 2001. He was the kind of man who laughed with his whole body, who remembered the names of waitstaff and tipped generously, who could fix a leaking faucet and quote Steinbeck in the same afternoon. We married in 2004 in a small ceremony in the backyard of his parents' house. His mother, Marjorie's idea, her territory, her rules even then. But I didn't think much of it at the time. We were in love. Love has a way of smoothing over the things you should be reading more carefully. For 17 years, we built a life together. Daniel ran Cole Precision, a mid-sized machine parts manufacturing company he had inherited from his father and grown into something genuinely impressive. 32 employees, contracts with 2 major automotive suppliers, a reputation for reliability that he was fiercely proud of. I taught elementary school. We had a house on Birchwood Lane with a garden I neglected pleasantly and a garage Daniel treated like a second home. He was always in there, restoring an old '69 Mustang he never quite finished, keeping tools in precise order on pegboards, tinkering. I teased him that he loved that garage more than he loved me. He always said the same thing. "The garage keeps my secrets, Maggie. You keep my heart." I thought it was just something he said. He died on a Tuesday in March 3 years ago. A car accident on Route 26, just outside of town. The police report said he lost control on a wet curve. It was raining. It's always raining in Portland in March. The other driver, a man named Roy Perkins, walked away with a bruised collarbone. Daniel didn't walk away at all. He was pronounced dead at the scene. He was 51 years old. The grief that followed was the kind that remakes a person from the inside out. I went through the motions, the funeral, the paperwork, the condolence cards, the terrible weeks of casseroles. Daniel's mother, Marjorie, stood at the graveside in a black dress that looked expensive and cried in a way that felt performative, though I told myself I was being uncharitable. His sister Victoria, 2 years younger than Daniel, gripped my arm at the reception and said, "We'll get through this together, Maggie. Family first." She said it with such warmth that I believed her. I shouldn't have. In the months after Daniel's death, I discovered the first complication. The business, Cole Precision, was in rougher shape than I'd known. Our joint attorney, Harold Sims, walked me through the books with the careful gentleness of a man delivering bad news he'd been dreading. There were gaps in the accounts, withdrawals I couldn't account for. Harold called them anomalies and suggested the business might have been under some strain Daniel hadn't shared with me. I was too numb to pursue it then. I signed what needed signing, transferred operational management to the interim board, and I came home to Birchwood Lane, and I closed the door to the garage, and I did not open it again. For 3 years, that door stayed shut. I went back to teaching. I saw a grief counselor for 18 months. I learned to sleep again, mostly. I learned to cook for one. I packed Daniel's clothes and gave most of them to Goodwill, keeping only his old flannel shirt that still smelled faintly of motor oil and something warm I couldn't name. Victoria called every few weeks with questions about the business, about the estate, about whether I'd thought any more about selling my share of Cole Precision. Marjorie sent Christmas cards. Polite, careful, persistent. Looking back now, I can see the pattern clearly. At the time, I read it as family concern. Then came the text. It was a Wednesday evening in October, the kind of gray Pacific Northwest night when the dark comes early and settles in. I was sitting on the couch with a glass of wine and a book I wasn't really reading when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced at the screen out of habit. The name stopped my heart. Daniel Cole. My hands were shaking before my brain had fully processed what I was seeing. I picked up the phone. I read the message 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, as if repetition would make it make sense. I'm alive. Check the safe in the garage. I sat very still for a long time. The wine glass sat forgotten. The book slid off my knee onto the floor. My first rational thought was that someone had gotten hold of his old SIM card, that this was a scam, a cruel coincidence, a mistake. My second thought, the one that came from somewhere deeper and older and less rational, was that Daniel had known something, that he had prepared something, that garage, the one I hadn't opened in 3 years, was waiting for me. I didn't go that night. I was too afraid of what I might feel standing in his space after all this time, the smell of oil and metal and him. I sat on the couch until past midnight. Then I went to bed and lay in the dark with my eyes open. But I knew, with the slow certainty of someone who has spent 3 years half sleeping, that I would go in the morning. I didn't sleep. Not really. I lay on my side of the bed. I still slept on my side, 3 years en tour, and watched the digital clock move through the small hours, while outside the rain had stopped and the neighborhood was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. My mind kept circling the same questions, tight and repetitive as a dog on a chain. Who had sent that message? Was Daniel's old number still active? Could someone have gotten access to his account? And beneath all of that, the question I kept pushing away and kept failing to push away. What if he really had known something was coming? By 5 a.m, I gave up on sleep. I made coffee, strong and black, and stood at the kitchen window watching the sky go from black to the particular shade of dark blue that precedes a Portland dawn. The garage door was visible from where I stood. The side door, the one that led to his workbench area. I had painted over a scuff on it 2 years ago, just to have something to do with my hands. I had not turned the handle. I thought about Daniel's words, the ones he used to say. "The garage keeps my secrets, Maggie." I had always taken it as the gentle boast of a man who liked his private space. Now I turned it over, and it felt different, weighted, intentional. I thought about the business, about the anomalies in the accounts that Harold Sims had mentioned and that I had been too grief-fogged to pursue. In the year following Daniel's death, Cole Precision had been restructured. Victoria had stepped in. She had some background in business administration, nothing remarkable, but she had presented herself as the family's natural representative, and the interim board had found her persuasive. I had been too shattered to contest it. I retained a minority ownership share, received quarterly distributions that were modest but regular, and tried not to think too hard about numbers. But in the past 6 months, the distributions had shrunk. Harold had sent a letter noting that revenues were underperforming expectations. I had filed it away. I had told myself I'd deal with it later, later had arrived at 5 a.m. on a Thursday in October in the form of a text from a dead man's phone number. When the clock reached 7, I put on my coat and my boots. I poured the rest of the coffee into a travel mug, and I walked out the back door and across the wet grass to the garage. The key was still on my key ring. I had never taken it off. I don't know why. Force of habit, some reluctance to make the removal final. My hand was steady as I put it in the lock. That surprised me. Inside, I had expected to fall apart. Instead, I felt something I can only describe as a cold, focused calm. The kind that arrives when a situation has become too serious for ordinary emotion. The garage smelled exactly as I remembered. Oil, metal, a faint trace of the wood polish he used on the Mustang's dash. The Mustang was still there, covered in a canvas tarp, patient and unfinished. His tools hung on the pegboards in their precise places. 3 years of dust had settled over everything like a thin gray membrane, but the organization beneath it was perfectly his. Orderly, deliberate, nothing out of place. I stood in the middle of the space for a moment and let myself feel it. Just for a moment. Then I started looking for the safe. I found it behind the workbench, built into the lower section of the wall, concealed behind a false panel that I hadn't known existed. A gray steel safe, combination lock, and taped to the front of it, in Daniel's handwriting on a strip of masking tape, a number sequence. He had left me the combination. I crouched down, hands steady, and turned the dial. Left, right, left. The mechanism released with a solid, definitive click. Inside was a manila envelope thick with papers and a small digital voice recorder. On the envelope, again in his handwriting, for Maggie. If you're reading this, I wasn't paranoid. I sat down on the cold garage floor and opened the envelope. I didn't go back inside for 2 hours. What I found there changed everything. Bank statements printed and annotated in Daniel's careful hand. Internal financial records from Cole Precision. A series of dated notes, written chronologically, beginning 14 months before his death. Email printouts, and 2 photographs. The bank statements showed systematic, sustained withdrawals from Cole Precision's operating accounts. Amounts ranging from $8,000 to $30,000 moved through a series of transfers that were designed to look like legitimate vendor payments, but were not. The vendor accounts were shells. I didn't understand every detail of what I was looking at, but Daniel had annotated everything in plain language. This payment, fictitious. This vendor, does not exist. This transfer, to account ending 7741. Account ending 7741. He had circled it 3 times in red ink, and in his notes, dated, methodical, heartbreaking, V and M have been doing this for at least 4 years. I confronted V last week. She denied it. Mother called me the next day and told me to let it go for the family. I am not letting it go. V. Victoria, M. Marjorie, his sister, his mother. I sat on the cold concrete floor of Daniel's garage with his papers in my lap, and I understood, with a slow and terrible clarity, that the grief I had spent 3 years carrying had been built on a lie. And beneath that grief was something else now, something harder and colder and more purposeful. I was angry. And for the first time in 3 years, that anger felt like fuel. I put everything back in the envelope. I tucked it under my arm. I locked the safe. I walked back into the house, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. I searched for 2 things: the best forensic accounting attorney in Portland and the best private investigator with financial fraud experience. I had a plan to build, and I was going to build it carefully. The law offices of Elliott Marsh were on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, the kind of office that communicated competence without pretension. Clean lines, good light, a view of the Willamette River through floor-to-ceiling windows. I had called the previous afternoon, given Harold Sim's name as a reference, and been given an appointment for Friday morning. I wore a gray blazer and carried Daniel's envelope in a leather folder I hadn't used since the last parent-teacher conference I'd organized. I wanted to look like someone who had her bearings. I was not entirely sure I did. Elliott Marsh was in his late 50s, compact and precise, with reading glasses he pushed up onto his head when he wasn't using them, and a manner that was thorough without being cold. He read through Daniel's materials without speaking for nearly 20 minutes, while I sat across from him and watched the river below. When he finally looked up, his expression was measured. "Mrs. Cole," he said, "your husband was documenting a long-running embezzlement scheme. Based on what I'm seeing here, and this is preliminary, the amounts involved are significant, potentially in the range of $400,000 over 6 years, possibly more." I had suspected it was large. Hearing the number still hit me like a physical thing. He also noted his intention to confront his sister, Marsh continued, and he died shortly after doing so. He let that sentence sit in the room between us. Neither of us said the word we were both thinking. "I want to retain you," I said, "and I need a private investigator, someone who can pull financial threads without tipping anyone off." Marsh nodded. He recommended a woman named Sandra Cho, a former IRS investigator who now worked financial fraud cases privately. He made the call while I sat there. Sandra could begin Monday. I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in 3 years: agency. The sensation was unfamiliar and slightly frightening, and I held on to it carefully, the way you hold a flame in the wind. I did not tell Victoria. I did not tell Marjorie. I went home, made dinner, graded papers. I was still teaching, still showing up, still performing the rhythms of ordinary life. Grief had made me good at performing normalcy. Now I put that skill to a different use, but I underestimated how closely I was being watched. Victoria called that Saturday. Her voice was its usual blend of warmth and subtle pressure, the cocktail I had grown so accustomed to I'd stopped noticing it. "Maggie, hi, just checking in. How are you doing? I've been thinking. The board is discussing some restructuring at the company, and I wanted to make sure you're in the loop. Nothing to worry about, just some changes to the ownership structure that would actually simplify things for you. Less paperwork on your end. Less paperwork. Less ownership." "That's thoughtful, Victoria," I said. "Send me whatever documents you have, and I'll have my attorney review them." A pause. Brief, but I noticed it. "Your attorney? You mean Harold?" "I have a new attorney," I said pleasantly. "Elliott Marsh." Another pause, longer. "Oh," she said. "I don't think I know him." "He's very good," I said. "I'm sure you'll meet him eventually." After I hung up, I sat for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen. She would tell Marjorie within the hour. I was certain of that. And they would begin to understand slowly that something had shifted. Good. Let them understand slowly. I needed time. What I didn't know yet, what Sandra Cho would discover within her first 2 weeks of work, was just how deep the scheme went. The embezzlement was only part of it. The shell vendor accounts led, eventually, through a chain of transfers that Sandra traced with the patient precision of someone who had done this for 20 years, to a personal account registered to a limited liability company that existed on paper only, and that account had made 2 significant payments 18 months before Daniel's death. One payment to a man named Roy Perkins. I remembered that name immediately. Roy Perkins. The other driver, the man who walked away from the accident with a bruised collarbone. I was sitting in Sandra Cho's office when she showed me the transfer records. I looked at the numbers for a very long time without speaking. Outside her window, the city moved and breathed and went about its business entirely unaware. "Roy Perkins was paid," I said finally. "Twice," Sandra said. Her voice was quiet and level. "Once 4 months before the accident, once 6 weeks after." "This is evidence of—" "It is circumstantial at this stage," she said carefully, "but it is significant. Elliot will know what to do with it." I thought about Daniel in this garage at night, writing his careful dated notes, circling account numbers in red ink. I am not letting it go. He had known the risk. He had known, and he had prepared for the possibility that something might happen to him, had set up that scheduled message as a fail-safe, a dead man's mechanism, set to send after 3 years if he never deactivated it. He had trusted that I would be ready to receive it, that I would be strong enough. I was going to make sure he was right. The plan, as Elliot Marsh laid it out over the following 2 weeks, had 3 components. First, a formal forensic audit of Cole Precision, which as a minority owner, I had the legal standing to demand. Second, the financial evidence Sandra had compiled, the shell accounts, the transfers, the payments to Roy Perkins, would be organized and presented to the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office, accompanied by Daniel's own documented notes. Third, a civil suit against Victoria and Marjorie Cole for breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and the misappropriation of company assets. The criminal referral regarding Roy Perkins and the possibility of a conspiracy charge connected to Daniel's death was a separate and more delicate matter that the DA would pursue on their own timeline. Elliot was careful to manage my expectations. "This is not a television show," he told me. "These things move slowly, but they move." I filed the audit demand on a Monday morning through Elliot's office. By Monday afternoon, Victoria knew. She called twice. I let both calls go to voicemail. The messages were careful, concerned, even, but underneath the concern, I could hear something else. A tightening, a recalculation. Marjorie called on Tuesday. I picked up that one because I wanted to hear her voice. "Margaret," she said. She called me Margaret only when she was trying to establish authority. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. This audit request has upset a lot of people at the company. Daniel's employees, people who've been there for years. I really think we should sit down and talk before this goes any further." "I appreciate that, Marjorie," I said. "My attorney will be in touch." "You don't need an attorney to talk to family," she said, and her voice had a new quality now, clipped, less warm, the mask slipping at its edges. "I'll let Elliot know you called," I said, and I hung up. They came to the house on Thursday evening, both of them. I saw Victoria's car in the driveway through the front window and felt a cold shock run through me. They had decided to escalate to in-person. I stood in the hallway for a moment, steadied my breathing, and opened the door before they could knock. Victoria was dressed carefully, hair pulled back, face arranged into an expression of concern and reason. Marjorie stood slightly behind her, and her expression was less carefully managed. Her jaw was set, and her eyes were flat in a way I had never let myself fully register before. "We need to talk, Maggie," Victoria said. "This isn't a good time," I said. "It needs to be," she said. She stepped forward slightly, not quite pushing, the gesture of a person accustomed to being accommodated. "This audit is going to destroy the company. 32 employees, Maggie. People with families. Is that what you want? Daniel would never have wanted that." There it was. Daniel's name, deployed as a weapon. "Daniel left me specific instructions," I said. "I'm following them." Victoria's expression shifted. "What instructions? What are you talking about?" "Good night, Victoria," I said. I stepped back and closed the door. There was a moment of silence. Then Marjorie's voice, low and hard, through the door. "You're making a very serious mistake, Margaret." I stood in the hallway with my back against the closed door and listened to them walk to the car and drive away. My hands were trembling, not from fear exactly, from the adrenaline of it, from the reality of what had just happened. I had looked them in the eye. I had not yielded. But 2 days later, Elliot called me with news that shifted the texture of things. He had received a call from a lawyer representing Victoria and Marjorie, a lawyer named Gerald Fitch, known in Portland legal circles for aggressive tactics and a high tolerance for gray areas. Fitch had suggested in careful legal language that should the audit and civil proceedings continue, his clients intended to raise questions about the validity of Daniel's marriage documentation, specifically regarding the prenuptial agreements that had been signed in 2004, and to challenge certain aspects of my standing as a beneficiary. In plain language, they were threatening to attack my legal right to anything Daniel had left me. "It's a pressure tactic," Elliot said. "The prenuptial agreement is airtight and the beneficiary designations are clear. But litigation is expensive and slow, and they know that." "Let them file," I said. My voice surprised me with its steadiness. "Maggie, let them file every motion they want to file, Elliot. I'm not stopping." That evening, I poured a glass of wine and sat in the backyard in the cool October air and let myself feel the full weight of it. The threats, the stakes, the loneliness of being one person against two people with resources and a lawyer willing to play dirty. I let myself feel it for exactly one evening. Then I went inside, took a long bath, read a novel I'd been meaning to read for months, and slept for 9 hours. When I woke up the next morning, I was ready again. Sandra Cho called on a Tuesday with news that required Elliot on the line as well. Roy Perkins, the man who had walked away from Daniel's accident, had been located in Medford, Oregon, working at an auto repair shop, which felt, in its grim irony, almost too on the nose. Sandra had not approached him directly. That was not her role. But she had established that he was reachable, that he had no prior criminal record, and that he had, in the months following the accident, made 2 significant cash purchases, a truck and a used boat, that were difficult to reconcile with his declared income. The DA's office had assigned an investigator to the case. Things were moving, slowly, carefully, the way Elliot had promised. I was learning patience, which is a harder discipline than anger. In the meantime, something else arrived. A letter from Gerald Fitch's office, addressed to me personally, not to Elliot. This was irregular. Lawyers are supposed to communicate through lawyers, and Elliot was not pleased when I forwarded it to him. The letter was written in formal language, but its content was a barely disguised offer. Victoria and Marjorie were prepared to settle. They would repay a negotiated portion of the disputed funds. I would drop the audit and the civil suit, and, crucially, I would sign a document agreeing never to raise questions about the circumstances of Daniel's death. I read that last clause twice. Questions about the circumstances of Daniel's death. They knew. They had always known. And now they were afraid. I did not respond to the letter. Elliot sent a formal reply to Fitch's office noting that all communications should be directed through counsel. But the letter sat with me, heavy and clarifying, because it confirmed what Sandra's financial evidence had suggested. This was not merely about money. This was about the night on Route 26 in the rain, and a man named Roy Perkins, and what they had paid him to do. I needed to talk to someone outside the legal process, someone who knew me before all of this, who could sit across from me and see me clearly. I called Karen Whitfield. Karen and I had been friends since our first year of teaching together, 2003. She was now the vice principal of a school in Beaverton, sharp and steady and constitutionally unable to offer empty comfort. We met for dinner at a small Italian place on Northwest 23rd, and I told her everything: the text, the garage, the safe, Daniel's notes, the financial evidence, the payment to Roy Perkins. I told her because I needed someone to see the full picture who wasn't billing me by the hour. Karen listened without interrupting, which is its own form of generosity. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You already know what you're going to do. You don't need my permission. I need someone to tell me I'm not losing my mind." "You're not losing your mind," she said. "You're the sanest person at this table. You've been the sanest person in your own life for 3 years, and you did it while being lied to. That's not nothing, Maggie." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand, and didn't trust myself to say anything for a moment. "Will you be around?" I asked. "Going forward, if I need." "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Simply. No drama. On the drive home, the city lights smearing through the rain on my windshield, I thought about Daniel sitting in that garage writing his notes, preparing for the worst, hoping for the best, trusting that I would be strong enough to see it through. Karen was right. I already knew what I was going to do. I had known since I sat on that cold concrete floor and read his words. I was going to see it through to the end. Every motion, every filing, every piece of evidence, every day of it. Whatever it cost. They came again on a Saturday in November, and this time it was different. Not Victoria's car pulling up unannounced, not hard voices through a closed door. This time Victoria called ahead, formally, politely, and asked if she might come by to talk. She used the word reconcile. She said she was sorry for how things had become between us. She said that Marjorie was willing to set aside her pride and hoped we could all find a better way forward. Her voice on the phone was measured and careful, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed her opening lines. I said yes, not because I believed her, because I wanted to see what they were offering, and because I wanted them to see that I was not afraid of them in my own home. I told Elliot immediately after hanging up. He listened without interrupting, then advised me not to sign anything, not to agree to anything verbally that could later be characterized as a concession, and to have a witness present if Oregon's all-party consent law made recording impractical. I called Karen before I'd even set the phone down. She arrived at noon, brought a bottle of sparkling water and a lemon cake she'd baked herself, and settled into the armchair by the window with the serene, observant manner of someone who had once managed a school cafeteria full of feuding 6-year-olds and found very little intimidating by comparison. I tidied the living room. I put out the good cups. I made a fresh pot of coffee. These small rituals of hospitality felt almost absurd under the circumstances, and I performed them anyway, partly from habit, partly because I wanted everything in that room to be mine. My cups, my table, my house. They arrived at 2 o'clock, exactly on time, which itself told me something. Victoria was dressed as if for church. Conservative blazer, pearl earrings, hair pulled back with the kind of deliberate neatness that signals effort rather than ease. Marjorie had done something with her hair and wore lipstick in a shade I'd never seen her choose before, a soft rose that was meant to read as approachable, grandmotherly even. The full performance of reasonableness, assembled and deployed with the care of a stage production. We sat in the living room on either side of the coffee table, and I poured coffee and offered the cups and smiled pleasantly because I could perform things too. Victoria began. She was sorry. Genuinely sorry, she said, pressing both palms flat against her knees in a gesture of sincerity, for the distance that had grown between us. She understood I had concerns about the business. That was completely natural. Grief did strange things to a person's perspective, and she wanted me to know there was nothing to hide. The audit would show that the company had faced genuine market pressures in the past 2 years. Some accounting decisions had been aggressive but not improper. She used that phrase twice, as if repetition would launder it. What I might perceive as anomalies were in fact standard business management decisions made under difficult market conditions, in good faith, by people who had been working night and day to preserve what Daniel had built. She was good. I'll give her that. She had the cadence of someone who genuinely believed her own argument, or had practiced it until the distinction no longer mattered. Then she shifted, and the shift was subtle, but I felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. She told me that the civil suit I was pursuing would tie up Cole Precision's assets for years, that the uncertainty alone was already affecting supplier relationships and employee morale, that the 32 employees, she mentioned them again, those 32 employees waited and deployed like a moral counterweight, had families, mortgages, children in school, that legal proceedings of this nature could force the company into a position where layoffs became unavoidable. She paused, let that sit, then said quietly, "Is that what you want, Maggie? Is that the legacy you want to leave for Daniel's company?" And then, underneath the table in the room's conversational architecture, Daniel would never have wanted that. There it was, his name, used as a lever. She had waited until she felt she needed it, and here she was using it, and I sat across from her with my coffee cup and my pleasant expression and felt something turn cold and precise inside me. Marjorie, who had held her silence with visible effort until now, leaned forward in her chair. She had always been a woman who communicated authority through posture, straight-spined, deliberate, the bearing of someone who expected to be the most significant person in any room she entered. Even now, even in her carefully softened lipstick, the posture was there. "You're still young, Margaret," she said. She called me Margaret here, too, in my own living room at my own coffee table, and it landed exactly as she intended it to, as a small proprietary correction. You have decades ahead of you, a whole life that can still be beautiful. Daniel would have wanted you to be happy. He would not have wanted you to spend your best years in courtrooms over money. She paused, and her eyes held mine with an expression that was almost convincing as tenderness. We are offering you a way out of all of this, a clean break, enough to be comfortable. Isn't that enough? Isn't that enough? The implication being, take what we offer, be quiet, and be grateful. Let us have the company. Let us have the money. Let us have the story of a car accident on a rainy Tuesday. And in exchange, we will allow you your comfort and your years and your small, uncomplicated life. I set my cup down. I appreciate you coming, I said. I'll have Elliot review the buyout proposal if you submit it through proper channels. Is there anything else? Victoria's warm expression flickered, just slightly, a fault line visible for half a second before the surface resettled. Maggie, I really think if you'd I think we've covered everything, I said. I stood up. Karen, from the armchair, took a quiet sip of her sparkling water and looked serenely out the window at the November garden, as if she were simply enjoying the view. The silence in the room lasted about 4 seconds. Then Marjorie stood, and the lipstick and the hair and the soft rose performance could not contain what came through her expression. A cold, compacted fury, old and practiced, the fury of a woman who had never in her adult life been refused by someone she considered beneath her consideration. She stood very straight. Her voice, when it came, was quiet. That almost made it worse than if she'd shouted. "You are going to regret this, Margaret," she said. "I want you to remember, when the time comes, that we tried." "Thank you for coming," I said. I walked them to the door. I held it open. I watched them cross the porch and descend the steps and walk to the car. Victoria did not look back. Marjorie paused at the passenger door, just briefly, one hand on the handle, and looked back at the house with an expression I still think about sometimes. Not rage exactly, something more calculating than that, an assessment. Then she got in the car. I closed the front door. I stood in the hallway. Karen appeared in the doorway from the living room, cup in hand. "You were extraordinary," she said simply. My hands were very cold. My heart was going fast. There was something under my sternum that was unquestionably fear, not the vague, anxious dread of the past 3 years, but a specific, grounded fear that came from having looked into Marjorie Cole's eyes when her mask slipped and seen what lived behind it. She had said we tried and meant it as a threat with a timeline attached, but beneath the fear, something I had learned by now to recognize and trust: determination. She had fed it herself without meaning to. Every manipulation, every deployed grief, every use of Daniel's name as a rhetorical instrument, all of it fuel. I went to the kitchen and stood at the window. The November garden was bare and silver in the afternoon light. Somewhere in it, next spring, I was going to plant dahlias. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the second week of December in a courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Multnomah County Courthouse. By this point, the civil case and the criminal referral had become publicly linked. Portland is not a large city. Legal and business circles overlap, and word had gotten around that Cole Precision was under investigation. There had been a brief item in the Oregonian's business section. I had declined to comment. I wore a dark blue dress and my good coat. Karen sat 3 rows behind me. Elliot was beside me at the plaintiff's table, papers arranged with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this many times. Sandra Cho was present as an expert witness, composed and meticulous. Victoria and Marjorie sat at the defense table with Gerald Fitch. Victoria was in a dark blazer. Marjorie looked older than I remembered, tighter around the eyes, something compacted and tense in her posture. Fitch was exactly what Elliot had prepared me for: confident, smooth, accustomed to controlling rooms. The hearing was not a trial, it was a procedural step, an evidentiary presentation to establish standing and grounds for the full civil proceedings. But Elliot had asked for permission to present the financial documentation in full, and the judge, a woman named Honorable Patricia Okafor, with a reputation for rigor and zero tolerance for courtroom theater E, had granted it. Sandra presented the financial records with the precision of a surgeon: shell vendor accounts, the transfer chain, account ending 7741, the 2 payments to Roy Perkins. She presented it in plain, methodical language, each document introduced into the record, each annotation of Daniels identified and explained. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. The numbers spoke. At the defense table, I could see Fitch writing rapidly on a legal pad. Victoria was still, very still, the stillness of someone managing themselves carefully. Marjorie had gone a particular shade of pale. Then Elliot asked that Daniel's personal notes be entered into the record. Fitch objected. Hearsay, he argued. Documents of uncertain provenance. Judge Okafor overruled the hearsay objection on the grounds that the notes constituted a business record and a personal account of observed events, and noted that the provenance had been established through forensic document examination confirming Daniel's handwriting. The notes went in. When Elliot read aloud the section in which Daniel wrote, V&M have been doing this for at least 4 years. I confronted V last week. She denied it. Mother called me the next day and told me to let it go for the family. I am not letting it go. I heard Marjorie make a sound, soft, almost inaudible. I did not look at her. The hearing continued. Fitch cross-examined Sandra with the practiced aggression of a man trying to create doubt. The transfers were complex. The shell accounts could have legitimate explanations. The payments to Roy Perkins were circumstantial. Sandra was unruffled. She answered each question with precision and without defensiveness. She had been doing this for 20 years. Then something happened that I had not expected. Roy Perkins had 4 days earlier agreed to speak with the DA's investigator. I learned later that he had retained his own lawyer upon hearing that a criminal investigation was underway, and that his lawyer had advised him that cooperation was his best option. At the hearing, the DA's office presented a brief summary of Perkins' preliminary statement, not his full testimony, which would come at criminal proceedings, but enough to establish that Perkins had been approached, that he had been paid, and that he had not been acting alone or on his own initiative. Fitch tried to interrupt. Judge Okafor silenced him with a look. I kept my eyes on the judge. I had decided weeks ago that I would not look at Victoria or Marjorie during the hearing, not from weakness, but because they were no longer the focus. The truth was the focus. Daniel's careful notes and his red ink circles and his voice on that recorder I had listened to a dozen times in the dark of my bedroom. Maggie, if you're hearing this, I need you to be brave. I know you are. You always were, even when you didn't know it. That was the focus. When the hearing concluded, Judge Okafor granted full standing for the civil proceedings and referred the matter of the Perkins payments to the DA's office with a notation that the evidence warranted serious criminal consideration. As we filed out of the courtroom, I passed within a few feet of Victoria for the first time all morning. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and there was nothing left in her face of the warmth she had performed for 3 years. Just a kind of hollowed-out calculation, running its numbers and finding them bad. You have no idea what you've done, she said quietly. I thought about Daniel on that wet road in March. I thought about a man named Roy Perkins and 2 payments from a shell account. I think I do, I said, and I walked past her into the gray December light. The next 4 months were the slowest and most painstaking of my life, and also the most purposeful. The civil case moved through its procedural stages with the grinding patience of institutions. The criminal investigation moved in parallel, in a different office, at a different rhythm, and I was not always privy to its progress. That was not my case to direct. I had done what Daniel had asked. I had found the evidence. I had put it in the hands of people who knew what to do with it. In February, Roy Perkins entered into a plea agreement with the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office. He pleaded guilty to a charge of vehicular homicide in exchange for cooperation and a sentencing recommendation that reduced his exposure. His cooperation meant testimony. His testimony meant, for the first time, direct sworn statements connecting the payments he had received to specific individuals who had commissioned them. The arrests were made on a Wednesday morning in early March, 3 years and 11 days after Daniel died on Route 26. I was at school when Elliot called. I stepped into the hallway outside my classroom, my 23 third graders making the usual cheerful noise behind the closed door, and I listened as he told me that Victoria Cole and Marjorie Cole had been taken into custody on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, and embezzlement. I stood in that hallway for a long time after he stopped talking. "Maggie," he said. "I'm here," I said. "Are you okay?" I thought about what okay meant. I thought about 3 years of cold coffee and closed doors and the flannel shirt I still kept folded in my dresser drawer. I thought about Daniel's voice on that recorder, steady and warm and slightly apologetic, telling me to be brave. "Yes," I said. "I think I am." The civil case settled 6 weeks later, in the way that civil cases sometimes settle when the defendant's personal freedom has become their primary concern and their legal resources are stretched beyond reasonable capacity. The terms required full restitution of the embezzled funds, $437,000 confirmed by the forensic audit, plus damages. My ownership share of Cole Precision was restored and recalculated to reflect the value that had been misrepresented to me since Daniel's death. The board, following the arrests of Victoria and Marjorie, had been reconstituted with new management, and the company, Daniel's company, the one he had built and tended and been proud of, was still operating. The 32 employees Victoria had used as a moral shield still had their jobs. Gerald Fitch withdrew from the case when it became apparent that his clients could no longer pay him. Fitch, for all his aggressive tactics, was in the end a mercenary. He followed the money, and when the money was gone, so was he. The trial, when it came in October, the following October, 13 months after I'd received that text, lasted 11 days. Victoria and Marjorie were tried together. Roy Perkins testified for 3 days. Sandra Cho's financial analysis was presented in full. Daniel's notes were read into the record. His voice recording was played in the courtroom, the recording from that small digital recorder I had found in the safe, where Daniel, in his methodical and careful way, had narrated his discoveries and his fears and his intentions, his voice in that room. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They returned guilty verdicts on all major counts. Victoria received 14 years. Marjorie, who was 67 and whose defense had leaned heavily on her age and her role as a secondary party, received 8. The judge was not, as he made clear in his sentencing remarks, moved by the arguments about family loyalty and advanced age when weighed against the deliberate destruction of a man's life, the manipulation of his widow, and the sustained theft from the employees his wife continued to invoke. I was in the courtroom for the verdict. I sat in the gallery, Karen beside me, Elliot at the plaintiff's table. When the foreman read the words, I felt something I am still not sure I can accurately name. Not triumph, not exactly. Something quieter, like a door closing softly on a very long room. I went home to Birchwood Lane. I made dinner. I sat in the garden in the October dark and thought about Daniel, and I talked to him, out loud, quietly. The way you talk to someone when you know they can't hear you, but the saying of it matters anyway. "I got them," I said. "You were right. I was ready." The garden was quiet. The neighbors' lights were on across the fence. A car passed on the street. I went inside and washed the dishes and went to bed, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I slept without dreaming. The year that followed was the first year of my life that I would call, without qualification, new. I did not sell the house on Birchwood Lane. I didn't want to run from the geography. I wanted to reclaim it. I repainted the kitchen the shade of yellow Daniel had always thought was too bright. I finished the garden. I opened the garage door one Saturday morning, put the Mustang up for sale, and converted the space into a studio where I painted, badly and joyfully, on weekend mornings. I took a sabbatical from teaching and traveled. Tuscany for 3 weeks with Karen, New Mexico alone in September. I learned that I was better company for myself than I had understood during the years when I'd been too sad to find out. The restitution settlement provided stability I hadn't had in 3 years. I was not wealthy, a teacher with a restored inheritance and a paid-off house, but I was secure in a way that let me breathe differently. Cole Precision stabilized under new management, a CEO named James Okafor, steady and transparent. The 32 employees Victoria had weaponized as a rhetorical shield were, in the mundane reality, simply still employed. Daniel had cared about those people. I found that I did too. As for Victoria and Marjorie, I made a deliberate decision not to track them closely. The broad contours were sufficient. Fitch had filed suit against them to recover his unpaid fees, a snake eating its own tail. Marjorie's house in Lake Oswego was sold to cover costs and restitution. Victoria's appeals were denied. Marjorie had requested a medical accommodation for her imprisonment and received the standard assessment. She was not terminally ill. She was simply old and in prison, which is a different thing. I did not pity them. I am not the kind of story that ends with forgiveness for its own sake. I had forgiven Daniel for carrying his fears alone, for trying to protect me. That forgiveness cost me something, and it was worth it. What Victoria and Marjorie had done was different in kind. They had taken a man's life for money and then sat at his funeral and said family first. I did not hate them. I simply set them down, the way you set down something heavy you've been carrying without realizing it, and walked forward. Karen and I met for dinner every few weeks. She was dating a history professor now, and watching her happiness was its own particular pleasure. I dated a little, carefully, in no hurry. Time, properly used, is not the enemy. I planted dahlias in the garden. They came up absurd and extravagant and brilliant in August, and I stood there in the late summer sun and laughed, really laughed, from somewhere genuine, Tiao, because they were so ridiculous and so alive and so exactly right. You always were brave, Maggie, even when you didn't know it. Now I know it. Thank you for listening to my story. If it moved you, if it made you think, leave a comment.